These are not anonymous witnesses. They are not people who spotted something unusual from a parking lot and posted it online. They are test pilots, combat veterans, engineers with doctoral degrees, people who are selected from tens of thousands of applicants to represent their countries in the most demanding professional environment human beings have ever created. People whose credibility was vetted so thoroughly before they ever left the atmosphere that their word, in almost any other context, would be considered beyond question. And they came back from space saying they had seen things they could not explain. Things that moved in ways that violated the physics of everything they had been trained to understand. Things that appeared on radar when nothing should have been there. Things that two people witnessed simultaneously. From a platform with no atmosphere and no weather, and no birds and no balloons, hundreds of miles above Earth. And NASA, in every single case, produced an explanation that either contradicted the witness, pointed to debris that did not match the description, or simply filed the report and moved on. This is the story of what those astronauts actually said, what the official responses actually were, and why. Decades later, the gap between those two things has never fully closed. Start with John Glenn, because what he saw was the first thing any American astronaut ever reported seeing in orbit that could not be immediately accounted for. February 20th, 1962, Friendship 7, the first American to orbit the Earth, was circling the planet in the dark, preparing to pass into daylight, when he looked out his window and found himself surrounded. Thousands of tiny glowing particles, drifting alongside the capsule, illuminated in the darkness, moving in what he described as a slow, flowing pattern. He transmitted to Mission Control, clearly and professionally, describing what he was seeing. Mission Control's initial concern was that the particles were debris from the capsule's heat shield, which would have been a serious structural problem. They were not. Every subsequent investigation ruled out the heat shield explanation. The particles continued appearing on Glenn's next orbit, and on the flight of Scott Carpenter in the same capsule type 4 months later, who reported the exact same phenomenon. The most widely cited explanation today is that the particles were ice crystals forming from the capsule's attitude control thrusters venting moisture, which sublimated and glowed in the sunlight. This explanation is plausible and widely accepted. It is also still not definitively proven to be the complete account of everything Glenn and Carpenter observed. The category NASA assigns to this case, and to dozens like it, is explained. The category the people who were there would assign to it is something else. 3 years later, in June of 1965, James McDivitt became the commander of Gemini for the first American multi-day spaceflight, the mission during which Ed White became the first American to walk in space. McDivitt was a highly experienced test pilot, former Air Force captain, and one of the most technically rigorous members of the early astronaut corps. He was not given to speculation, he was given to precision, and on June 4, 1965, while flying over Hawaii, he saw an object outside his window that he could not identify. His description was specific, a cylindrical or tubular shape with what appeared to be arms or protrusions extending from it. It was on a parallel course to the Gemini capsule. It appeared to be in a stable orbit. He reached immediately for his camera and took both still photographs and film footage of it. What happened next depends on who you ask. NASA's official position, supported by space historian James Oberg, is that the object was almost certainly the spent second stage of the Titan II rocket that had placed McDivitt and Ed White in orbit, which they had attempted to rendezvous with earlier in the mission. There are problems with this explanation. At the time of the sighting, radar showed no objects near the Gemini 4 capsule, matching the characteristics McDivitt described. NORAD was unable to correlate any known object in their tracking database to the sighting at the time it was reported, and when the photographs were released, they did not show the object McDivitt described. The images that emerged from NASA were blurry, inconclusive, showing nothing that matched a cylindrical shape with protrusions. McDivitt himself, years later, said he believed the photographs had been switched. Not misidentified, switched, a decorated military officer and NASA astronaut of unimpeachable professional standing, saying that the photographs he took of an unidentified object were replaced before they were made public. NASA has never addressed this claim directly. 6 months after Gemini 4, in December of 1965, astronauts James Lovell and Frank Borman were in orbit on Gemini 7. A transcript of their mission communications contains a moment that has been discussed and debated ever since. Lovell transmitted to Mission Control the following words: "Said we have a bogey at 10 o'clock high." Mission Control's immediate response was to ask whether what they were seeing was the booster, meaning the rocket stage that had placed them in orbit. Lovell's response was clear. He said it was a bogey, not the booster, something else. Something they could see separately from the booster. Official explanations have ranged from debris associated with their launch vehicle to optical illusions produced by the unusual visual environment of orbital flight. Frank Borman himself later stated that what they saw was the booster, or debris from the booster, and that anyone claiming otherwise was misrepresenting the record. Lovell has been less categorical about what the secondary object actually was. The transcript exists, the word bogey is in it, and the distinction between the booster and the bogey was made by the astronauts themselves in real time. In a professional communication with Mission Control that was recorded and preserved, Gordon Cooper is in a category by himself among the Mercury and Gemini-era astronauts. both in terms of what he reported and in terms of the consistency and conviction with which he reported it for the rest of his life. Cooper was the last American to fly in space alone, piloting Mercury Atlas 9 in May of 1963, a solo mission that kept him in orbit for 22.5 hours. During his final orbit, Cooper reported something that crossed a line that most unexplained sightings do not cross. He reported seeing a glowing, greenish object approaching his capsule in the tracking station at Moochea, near Perth, Australia. Confirmed that they had a radar return corresponding to an object in Cooper's vicinity that matched his description. This was not a lone eyewitness account. It was a corroborated report from a trained astronaut in an independent radar facility of an unidentified object approaching a crewed American spacecraft. NBC was covering the mission live. When Cooper landed, reporters who had been monitoring his communications asked to question him about the sighting. According to Cooper's own later accounts, they were told they were not permitted to do so. NASA has never confirmed or denied giving this instruction. What is documented is that no detailed public accounting of the radar corroboration was ever provided, and the incident does not appear in NASA's official mission summaries in the way that it appears in Cooper's own testimony. Cooper testified about this and other incidents before the United Nations in 1978. He wrote about them in his autobiography. He spoke about them publicly until his death in 2004. His position never wavered. He was convinced that what he and hundreds of other military pilots and astronauts had seen over the course of his career was real, was documented within government channels, and was being kept from the public. He did not arrive at this position late in life, or in retirement. He stated it clearly and on the record from the moment he was able to do so freely. Edgar Mitchell walked on the moon. He was the sixth human being to do so, serving as lunar module pilot on Apollo 14 in February of 1971. He held a doctorate in aeronautics and astronautics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He was a Navy captain and a test pilot. By any measure of professional credibility, he belongs at the top of any list of reliable witnesses. And what he said, repeatedly, publicly, and in detail across the last 4 decades of his life, was that the extraterrestrial presence on and around Earth is real, that governments have known about it and classified it, and that he had met with military and intelligence officials from multiple countries who described personal encounters with extraterrestrial craft and beings. He was careful to distinguish what he knew from first-hand experience and what he had been told by others. His first-hand experience during Apollo 14 was described as a profound sense, during the return journey from the moon, that the universe was in some way conscious and that his own relationship to it was different from what he had previously understood. He was more cautious about attributing specific visual sightings to his time in space, but his convictions about the broader reality of the phenomenon, convictions he held and expressed publicly for more than 40 years until his death in 2016, were never retracted, never softened, and never adequately addressed by NASA, which issued a single brief statement saying it did not share his opinions and left it at that. Then there is the case that most American audiences have never encountered at all, because it happened on the other side of the Cold War. On May 5, 1981, Soviet cosmonaut Vladimir Kovalyanok was aboard the Salyut 6 space station, floating above the South Atlantic, moving toward the Indian Ocean. He had just finished a session of gymnastic exercises. He looked through the porthole. What he saw, in his own words, delivered years later at a press conference, was an object he could not explain, behaving in a way he described as impossible according to the laws of physics. It appeared in front of him, changed its shape, and then, as he watched it, split apart and separated into what he described as 2 glowing halves before disappearing. He immediately called his mission partner, Viktor Savinik, to the porthole. Savinik confirmed he could see it too. 2 trained cosmonauts on a Soviet military space station, neither of whom had any incentive to fabricate or exaggerate an encounter that their own government's press would subsequently describe with skepticism, both watching the same object behave in a way that neither of them could reconcile with anything in their technical training. After he returned to Earth, scientists told Kovalyanok that instruments on the ground had registered a significant radiation emission on the same day and at approximately the same time as his sighting. He said publicly, and repeatedly, that he does not believe anyone who claims that astronauts and cosmonauts have never seen anything extraordinary in space. The Soviet government never provided an official explanation for what the 2 cosmonauts observed. The Russian government has not provided one since. What links all of these cases is a pattern that becomes more visible the more cases you examine. The witnesses are impeccably credentialed. The sightings are reported through proper professional channels at the time they occur. The official responses either produce explanations that the witnesses themselves dispute, or produce no formal explanation at all. The documentation that would definitively resolve the question, radar logs, classified mission transcripts, internal NASA investigation reports, is either not publicly available, was never compiled in a form that reached the public, or was described by the witnesses themselves as having been altered before release. And the astronauts who spoke most forcefully about what they saw did so after leaving active service, when they were no longer subject to the institutional pressures that govern what a serving astronaut can say on the record. None of this constitutes proof of extraterrestrial contact. The skeptical explanations for individual cases, the spent rocket booster for McDivitt, the ice crystals for Glenn, the optical effects for Lovell and Borman, are not unreasonable, and some of them are probably correct. The orbital environment is genuinely strange, genuinely capable of producing visual phenomena that experienced pilots have misidentified in documented cases. Human perception, even highly trained human perception, is not infallible, and the emotional and physiological intensity of spaceflight does not necessarily make it more reliable. But there's a difference between an explanation that is plausible and an explanation that is complete. The radar return in Gordon Cooper's case was never explained in public. The missing photographs from McDivitt's mission were never accounted for. The radiation emission logged on the day of Kovalyanock's sighting was never correlated to any known source. The pattern that emerges from case after case is not a pattern of wild claims made by unstable individuals. It is a pattern of precise, professional reports made by people at the top of their fields, generating institutional responses that are either incomplete, unavailable, or contradicted by the people who are there. The May 2026 Pursue file releases from the U.S. government included, for the first time, partial transcripts from Apollo missions that had not previously been publicly available. The Apollo 17 3-light photograph is now under active Pentagon investigation. The conversation about what astronauts have seen, and what was done with what they reported, is no longer confined to documentaries and conference panels. It is now part of a formal, active government disclosure process. However incomplete that process remains, what the files released so far do not contain is the definitive resolution to any of the individual cases described above. The radar logs from Muccia on the day of Cooper's sighting are not in the public record. The original McDivitt photographs, if they exist in a form different from what was released, have not surfaced. The full Soviet records from the Salyut 6 mission remain in Russian archives that no external researcher has been given access to. The accounts of the astronauts and cosmonauts who were there remain, as they have always been, the most complete version of the record that anyone outside the relevant governments has ever been permitted to see. And those accounts say, consistently and from witnesses whose professional credibility in every other domain has never been questioned, that something was out there that no one has yet explained.